Good morning. In this 50-day season of Easter, we've been looking at the very diverse resurrection and post-resurrection accounts that we find in our four Gospels. This morning is the fourth, and if Daryl were here, he'd be happy to hear the last sermon in this series. We have not gone in the normal order. We started with storytelling from the Gospel of John, and that was on Easter Sunday morning. Then we looked at Mark, focusing on his original and very abrupt ending. Then we looked at Matthew, with his focus on geography, especially Galilee of the Gentiles, as he puts it. And this morning we're looking at Luke. But before we look at the ending of Luke, we're going to look at Luke's beginning. And there's a reason for it, and I think it works. Luke begins with what has come to dominate our consciousness when it comes to the Christmas story. And here's what we find in Luke, and only in Luke, when it comes to the Christmas story. The angel Gabriel appears before the young woman Mary and tells her she will have a miraculous baby who will be called the Son of the Most High, and who will receive from God the throne of his father David, and whose kingdom will never end. Lofty words from the angel. At which point Mary has a practical question about human reproduction. When that little issue is cleared up, she says, "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled." And then she and her fiancé Joseph have to travel to Bethlehem for a census, government, bureaucracy. It's always imposing itself. But when they get there, there is no guest room available, so they have to stay in an outbuilding with animals, which is where the baby Jesus is born, wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. Meanwhile, angels appear to shepherds keeping watch over their flocks by night, and they are sent to find the baby in the manger, and they do, and they praise God while spreading the news about Jesus. A little over a month later, and we often skip over this in our Christmas and post-Christmas celebrations, unfortunately, Joseph and Mary go to the temple to present their newborn baby to the Lord, and this was required by Jewish law. And that's when they encounter the elders, Simeon and Anna, who each separately recognize, as they see this baby in the temple, recognize that the salvation and redemption of God has arrived. A new era has begun, these older people see. And again, everything I just told you is found only in Luke. But while that summary is very cozy and very Christmassy, it does not actually include everything Luke describes at the beginning of his gospel. I left some things out for dramatic purposes. Because, as you know, Mary is not the only person the angel Gabriel visits. Before visiting Mary, about a month before, about 6 months before, Gabriel visits Zechariah, a priest. In fact, the angel Gabriel visits Zechariah in what is called the most holy place of the temple. It's not a subtle name. And Zechariah was chosen by lot to have this most honored of all priestly duties. It was a duty that not every priest got to experience, because you were chosen by lot, and the Jews thought that was God's hand in choosing. It was a duty where you were expected in the most holy place to have an encounter with God and to return to the people waiting outside the temple, to return with a message from God. That is where the angel Gabriel meets Zechariah. Zechariah, a professional religious person, a professionally religious older man. And Gabriel and Zechariah have a conversation that's nearly identical to the conversation Gabriel will eventually have with Mary, except that the conversation with Zechariah does not go well. Zechariah also has a concern he voices about human reproduction. But the way he asks his question shows the angel Gabriel that even in this most holy place, in the presence of an angel of God, Zechariah the priest doesn't really have much faith. So Gabriel the angel gets a bit miffed, takes away Zechariah's ability to speak, and in what can only really be kind of a funny scene, the priest wanders back out to his waiting people and is unable to say anything or do anything but make ridiculous hand signs and gestures. And then 6 months later, Gabriel has his nearly identical but vastly superior conversation with Mary. And then helps her out by telling her that her old cousin, Elizabeth, and that is Zechariah's wife, is also miraculously pregnant. In other words, Gabriel gives young, miraculously pregnant Mary, exactly what Mary needs: someone she can talk to. And I often think of that as the very first Christmas present. So Mary goes to visit Elizabeth, and the two of them in Zechariah's home, and I'm saying it that way because that's how they would have thought of it in the first century. In the ancient world, it was Zechariah's home. In his home, these two women exclaim in loud voices and sing and are filled with the Holy Spirit, and they, the women, proclaim the good news of God. All while Zechariah, the man priest, has no choice but to remain silent and listen. And only then does the rest of Luke's gospel proceed. Only after Luke shows us quite dramatically that the woman gets it while the man does not. The woman believes while the man does not. The women proclaim the gospel first, while the men eventually catch up. So now, with all of that, frankly, massive foreshadowing lurking in the back of our minds, now we can look at how Luke describes the resurrection and the post-resurrection events at the end of his gospel, now that we've looked at the beginning. And by the way, all of this stuff with Gabriel and Zechariah and Mary would have been in the back, actually in the front of the minds of Luke's original listeners. Because, as I keep reminding us, they likely would have heard the entirety of Luke's gospel read aloud in one go. So for us here today, by miraculous happenstance, on May 25th, Christmas was exactly 5 months ago. For them, sitting and listening to Luke read aloud, the Christmas story was only about maybe 2 hours ago. So it was in their minds. So let's turn to the post-Easter story. And it turns out that, like with Christmas, there are so many things about the Easter story that come to us from the Gospel of Luke and only from the Gospel of Luke. And because we're exploring this season how the Gospel narratives are different, diverse, and each with their own sort of agenda and lesson to pass along, let me list for you some elements that are found only in Luke. Only. When the women go and tell the disciples about the resurrection, the disciples don't believe them. That's only in Luke. Now, if you're super keen, you might say, "Unto me." But Mark describes that very same thing, the disciples not believing the women, at the end of his gospel. And then I would say, "Unto thee." Not really. It's there, it's in print, but it's after what scholars universally acknowledge as the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. It's there, but it's in the part that was clearly added later by somebody else trying to harmonize the different Gospels. So, it doesn't count. It's there, but with a massive asterisk. Okay, that's the first element. That's Luke only. Second, this super well-known story about the two men walking on the road to Emmaus. It's only found in Luke. Pamela read you some of that story this morning. We're going to look at it a little bit more later on. Third, maybe you'll remember this. There's a moment when the disciples think Jesus is just a ghost after the resurrection. So he asks for some food and he eats it while they watch. And we are told, and this detail is preserved 2,000 years later, it was broiled fish. Broiled. And he does it to prove that he's got a real physical body. That is only in Luke. Now there is a post-resurrection fish fry in the Gospel of John, but that's about hospitality. That's not about proving that Jesus has an actual body. The fourth element that's Luke only, this one surprised me when I first learned of it. After the and when you hear what it is, you might think, wow, Paul lives a life where this is the kind of thing that is surprising and interesting. Yes, I do. After the resurrection, in neither Matthew, nor Mark, nor John, does Jesus ever re-explain to his disciples how the Hebrew Scriptures say that the Messiah would suffer and be killed and be raised on the third day. Never in those other Gospels does Jesus explain this to his disciples after the resurrection. But in Luke, Jesus does that twice. Once on the road to Emmaus with those two travelers, and once again later with the disciples after eating that broiled fish. So explaining, fulfilling the Scriptures. Okay, I've been trying to introduce these Luke-only elements without showing how they're related, without giving away the story that I think Luke is telling. But now I'm going to end with one last Luke-only element. Well, there's a beautiful forest for you. Just in case you're bored. You can think to yourself, I could be there. Okay, I'm going to end with one last, maybe I'm ending now. I don't know if is that a signal? That's enough, Paul. Here is one last Luke-only element that will start off a chain reaction of events. And this chain reaction will be our main focus. So here we go. Only in Luke do the angels scold, and I'm putting that in kind of scare quotes here, scold the women at the empty tomb for not remembering that, of course, the Messiah will suffer and die and rise again. Now, before we get into it, in John, all the two angels do is ask Mary Magdalene why she's crying. That seems like you don't need to send angels for that task. Really. Yeah, just go ask her why she's crying. That's it? In Mark, the one angel says, Jesus isn't here, he's risen, he's gone ahead to Galilee, so go meet him there. That's in Mark. In Matthew, the one angel says basically the same thing, he's not here, he's risen, go to Galilee. But in Luke, our gospel this morning, the two angels, I'm just trying to emphasize the diversity in these accounts, they seem quite a bit more aggressive. Let me read it to you. These are the angels addressing the women. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? That's their opening line. He's not here. He's risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? He said, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again. It just feels like, don't you remember? And again, compared to the other three Gospels, where the angels don't do very much, this is aggressive. Which, of course, focuses our attention on those poor women and on their response. And what do we find? We find in Luke their response described very simply. Here it is. Then the women remembered Jesus' words. That's it. Then the women remembered. They remembered. Simple as that. And I want to emphasize here that so would the original first century listeners have remembered Jesus' words because, again, they would very likely have been listening to the entire Gospel of Luke read aloud in one sitting, and in that Gospel they would have already heard twice Jesus say exactly what the scolding angels are reminding the women that Jesus said. In other words, it would have been in every one of the listeners' minds already that Jesus said this twice. Here are the two times. The first time was right after Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And then just like sucker punches them with, "And who do you say that I am?" And it's when Peter says, you are the Messiah. And immediately we read this. Then Jesus strictly warned them not to tell anyone about this. And Jesus said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the third day raised to life." So that's the first time in Luke's gospel. And the second time was just before the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So in other words, basically just a week before the resurrection, a week before what we're hearing described right now. Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, and let's be generous here, maybe in their defense, maybe Jesus wasn't very clear about what he told them. Let's find out. We are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, spit on him. They will flog him and kill him. On the third day, he will rise again. That was a week ago. It was pretty clear, is what I'm saying. And the first century listeners would have just heard this. So they were primed for this by Luke. So when the angel asks the women, "Don't you remember what he said?" that question makes sense. And the women do remember, and that also makes sense. They remembered. So the question is, why do I keep doing this? The question is, what happens next? In the Gospel of Luke, what happens next? "Don't you remember?" And then the women say, "Oh yeah, I do." Because he just said it. In the Gospel of Luke, what happens after the women get scolded and then remember? And this is where I think, and it could be me projecting what I want to see, but I think it gets kind of funny in a tragic battle of the sexes kind of way. Because the men do not remember Jesus' words. The men do not get it. And it becomes kind of clear as we roll along that the men might never have gotten it in the first place. You can't remember what you never knew. So let's take a look at what happens in this funny, tragic battle of the sexes. Well, the first thing is that the women, who not only remember Jesus' words, but also believe them, which is pretty important, rush back to the disciples to share this incredibly good news about the resurrection. And how do these male disciples respond? Well, we've already talked about it. I'm going to quote now. "But the disciples did not believe the women, because the women's words seemed to the men like nonsense." Notice something. the men are not just disrespecting the women. All the women are doing is reminding them of the words Jesus said about a week ago. The men are basically saying that the words of Jesus are nonsense. On the surface, it looks like they're disrespecting the women, but it goes deeper than that. Then, Luke tells us, Peter runs to the tomb. Peter, always a man of action. Usually stupid action, but action. Peter runs to the tomb and does indeed find the tomb empty. But does that mean that Peter then remembers and believes Jesus' words? No, it does not. Here's what we're told. Peter went away, wondering to himself what had happened. This is Peter, the one who declared Jesus to be the Messiah, and then right away, in that moment, heard Jesus predict death and resurrection. Peter sees an empty tomb and wondering what happened. This is not a good start for team men. So what next? Well, still on the very same day of the resurrection, we have the road to Emmaus story that Pamela read to us. And because of this battle of the sexes theme that we're exploring in Luke, I had Pamela stop at this moment. I'll read it again and then we'll keep going. But as if all of that weren't bad enough, say the two travelers to Jesus, but they don't know it's Jesus. Now some of our women are driving us out of our minds. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body, so they came back and told us they had seen angels who said Jesus was alive. Some of us went to the tomb to see what in the world they were talking about, and the tomb was empty, like the women said, but no one has seen Jesus anywhere. We have no idea what's going on. Now, I had Pamela stop there because there were children present, and what happens next is a little harsh, but also pretty funny. Jesus says to these two travelers, "How foolish you are!" That's ancient talk for, "You morons! How foolish you are, and slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Didn't the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Now, these two road to Emmaus travelers still don't recognize Jesus, of course, not until he breaks the bread. But the moment they do recognize him, he disappears, which is a little upsetting. And right away, without waiting for the morning, as would be normal and safe, they rush back to Jerusalem to tell the others. But the others, the other disciples, they have their own news to share with these two travelers. And here's what the other male disciples say, and it sounds like the men are finally catching up. They're starting to get it. That's what it sounds like. "It's true," the disciples say. "The Lord has risen and appeared to Peter." Then the two travelers told what happened to them on the way to Emmaus and how they recognized Jesus when they broke the bread. So things are looking good for the men. They're catching up. Right? Well, here's what happens next. Right then, right during that conversation, Luke says, while they were saying all these things, and these were all the correct things to say about how the Lord was risen. The Lord is risen indeed. He broke bread. Jesus appeared in their midst and said, "Peace be with you," which was just a normal, like, "How you doing?" And did these men say, "See, here he is. It's true. We knew it"? No, they did not. They were startled. I'm reading now. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. Jesus said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones, as you can see I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. and they still did not believe. And the English translation is because of joy and amazement. But the Greek word that's translated amazement is a Greek word that means your mind has been displaced. You're out of your mind, or your mind is out of you. Jesus asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" So they gave him a piece of broiled fish, well done. And he took it and he ate it in their presence. And he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms." In other words, they still hadn't gotten it. They were saying all the right words, but they had still none of the belief, none of the understanding. So Jesus patiently began yet again, and we read this. Then Jesus opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what was written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and the changing of minds and the forgiveness of sins will be preached to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem." Now, this whole battle of the sexes subplot, all of these elements I've just described, they are all of them only found in the Gospel of Luke. This is Luke's unique post-resurrection flavor. Then Luke ends his Gospel with a very quick description of the ascension. He has a longer description in his volume 2, which we call the book of Acts. But in Luke, it's just a really quick description of the ascension, and after that, we read this. Then the disciples worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they stayed continually at the temple praising God. And that's the end of Luke's Gospel. I want to make one more point about Luke before we conclude. And that is that Luke does something in his writing, in his very careful structuring of the gospel. He does something we also saw that Matthew does. Luke matches his ending of his book with the beginning of his book. Here's what I mean. Luke's gospel begins and ends with the women getting it and the men not getting it. The women believe and understand, and the men do not. And that's why I spent time at the beginning of the sermon on how Gabriel's conversation goes so much better with Mary than with Zechariah. That's why we looked at Mary and Elizabeth proclaiming and singing the good news of God, while Zechariah, in his own household, the man, the priest, could do nothing but listen. Luke's gospel also begins and ends with God being praised in the temple. The male disciples end Luke's gospel by praising God in the temple, as we just heard. But remember that Luke's gospel begins with Simeon and Anna praising God at the temple as they see the newborn Jesus and recognize that the kingdom has come. And Luke's gospel begins and ends with a kind of universalism, meaning this Messiah is not just for the Israelites, but for all the people on earth, Jews and Gentiles alike. Here's what I mean. At the beginning of Luke, we hear this from the old man Simeon in the temple. Simeon holds the baby or sees the baby and says this, "My eyes have seen your salvation, Lord, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel." So the very beginning of Luke makes it clear this is for all. And at the end of Luke, we hear this from Jesus himself. The changing of minds and the forgiveness of sins will be preached to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem, but all nations. So, to conclude, Luke's writing dominates our understanding of the Christmas and Easter stories. He's a good writer. That's why. Scholars agree. Those that can read New Testament Greek and are really fluent with it, they agree that Luke is by far, it's not even really close, by far Luke is the best of the four gospel writers. And because of the power of his writing and his skill, those original first century listeners would not have missed the themes that Luke so carefully wove into his gospel from the very beginning to the very end, including these themes. The women get it, and the men don't. Also, the gospel is for all people, Jews and Gentiles alike. And this story, while starting in Jerusalem, was always intended for the whole world. I've said this before, but it really is worth repeating because it's just too easy to forget. In that time and in that place, you could not have had more primary, clear categories into which humanity was divided. Men versus women. Jews versus Gentiles. These categories were hierarchical. These categories were in opposition. Men were in, women were out. Jews were in, Gentiles were out. And in that context, with his powerful writing, Luke shows quite clearly that the women understand the kingdom of God before the men do. We can ask ourselves why this is, and I think the answer is pretty clear. Those hierarchies Luke shows, he doesn't really say it, but he shows it. These hierarchies, Jesus came to blow them all up. To literally, I'm quite proud of this line, to literally blow those hierarchies to kingdom come. That is good. That's just objectively good. The kingdom had come. And Luke, thanks be to God, used good, powerful writing, along with, I would say, a pretty healthy dose of a sense of humor, at least that's what I think, that's what I see, to make this as clear as he could. The Messiah has come. The bonds of death and the bonds of oppressive categories have been broken. In God's eyes, there is no such thing as a dirty outsider. We are, all of us, Luke shows us, all of us, children of God. Amen to that.